everyone. So, we are discussing the rebel preference method, and this is the last method that we need to discuss. This is the cost of illness approach. And sometimes we are saying this cost of illness approach is a part of the damage cost approach or loss of output approach. So, that is why we have taken into account. So, it can be sometimes synonymously used. So, and these are the outlines of this cost of illness approach. So, first of all we will be discussing what is the damage cost method, then we will be comparing between this defensive behavior method that we have already explained with the damage cost method, so that we can get to know what is the similarities and what are the differences between these two methods. And then we will be discussing what is the cost of illness approach and how this cost of illness approach is different from the damage cost method, whether it is the same method or something different. Then we will be discussing what are the different steps that we need to take into account for doing this cost of illness study, and then we will be having the concluding remarks on this cost of illness approach. Let us discuss with the damage cost method. So, what is the very meaning of this damage cost method, and then we will be comparing with the defensive expenditure method. So, as you understand from the very meaning, so in damage cost method what we are targeting is to estimate the resource cost. So, why resource cost? Because what are the costs that is occurring to the resources in case of some environmental changes, let us say environmental bad like the pollutions. So, here in damage cost method what we are doing, we are estimating the direct resource cost as well as the indirect resource cost, and combinedly this is representing what is known as the damage cost. In a layman's language we can say damage cost is nothing but we need to calculate what is the amount of damages that a particular change in environmental bad has created, and this is represented in terms of direct damage cost to the resources and indirect damage cost to resources, and combinedly we are saying this is the total damage cost. And again we need to understand what is direct damage cost and what are the components that we need to take into account in order to estimate the indirect damage cost. So, in direct damage cost we are if we are taking the case of let us say the pollutions, right, on any of the resources, let us say your health. So, in that case we can say that direct costs are the expenditure that the individuals are making, right, for treating their illness or to repair any of the property which is been affected by this environmental change, that is because of the pollutions, or and also if you are doing any kind of replacement in the property or in these resources because of these pollutions, so that the materials would be maintained, right. So, in direct cost what you are taking into account, expenditure to treat the illness or to repair the particular resource or replace the particular resource or maintain the damaged materials. And in case of indirect costs we are taking into account the opportunity cost. So, what is opportunity cost? The next best alternative that is foregone, right. So, we are taking into account the opportunity cost of reduced productivity or the amount of output we are foregoing because of the environmental pollutions. So, in this case let us explain that how this indirect costs are measured. We are saying that we are using the opportunity cost of reduced productivity. So, how it is so? So, when you are saying that pollution, because of the pollutions you are falling sick, right, and that is why your productivity is decreased. So, because of the pollutions you are losing or reducing the your productivity, right. So, that must be taken into account, which is known as the opportunity cost of reduced productivity. So, that means if the pollutions was not observed, then your productivity could be added, right. You are not going to lose any kind of productivity. So, this is the opportunity cost of reduced productivity, right. Or you can say the output foregone because of environmental pollutions. So, if you are not actually sick, if you are well, then obviously your output, the household production output could have been increased. Because you are not well, that is why you are not in a position to increase the do any kind of work and increase the output of the household. So, that is expressed in terms of output foregone because of the increased pollutions in the environment. And as you understand that this damage cost method takes into account both the direct cost, that is in terms of the medical expenditure or repair, and indirect cost. So, this method uses the reduction in the real resource costs, right, to measure the benefits of reduced pollutions. So, after understanding this damage cost, now let us analyze how this damage cost is different or is similar with the defensive expenditure method that we have already explained. So, if you are talking about the defensive expenditure method or defensive behavior method we are saying, so what is the target? So, it analyzes how human behavior is responding if there is any change occurred in the environment. And the second, what would be the impact of this behavior on the outcome that we are experiencing. So, in our defensive expenditure examples, right, what we have taken into account the pollution as well as the noise pollution or air pollutions as well as the number of sick days, right. So, here in defensive expenditure we are analyzing how behavior responds to changes, that when pollution changes in the environment, when pollution increases, then how human behavior is changed, whether you are not exposing your children to the outdoor or you are making some expenditures like fitting some sound system, so that or insulating your house, so that the noise, outside noise cannot be entered into your house. So, here when the environmental changes happens, your behavior also changes. So, this is what we are analyzing, how the human behavior is responding to the change in environment and what is the impact of this behavior on the outcome experience, that is obviously you need to increase your utility. And in this context, the damage cost, it implicitly assumes that there is no behavioral response to environmental changes. So, that means here the same situation happens, that means your household and you observe that the pollution has been increased, right. So, when the pollution has been increased and you got to know and you change your behavior either in terms of taking some aborting or some expenditures, or you are actually changing your very behavior by changing the lifestyle or changing the time itself, right, the way you are making use of time, then it is a case of aborting expenditure method, right. But when you know that certain environmental changes have already been done, has already occurred and the pollution has increased, but still this is not reflected in terms of your behavioral patterns. That means you are not actually responding to the environmental changes, right. So, in that case this is known as the damage cost method. And in defensive expenditure, the second more important difference that we can make between these two methods is that in case of defensive expenditure, the method is typically designed to estimate the economic value, that is we are more interested to find out what is the willingness to pay, right. But whereas in this damage cost method we cannot estimate this economic value of this particular environmental bad. And the third one you can say, or in continuation to this we can also say that this damage costs are actually less than the willingness to pay, and they are easier to estimate, and it can also be understood by anyone, even a layman can understand this damage cost estimations, that when the pollution increases or any of the environmental changes occurred, how it is impacting the health, or how it is impacting the resources, and what is the cost to it. So, in contrast to these differences, there are some similarities that we can also bring out between this defensive expenditure method and this damage cost method. So, what are those similarities? So, as you understand, we talked about the reveal preference method. Obviously, both of these methods are under the family of the reveal preference method. Moreover, both of these methods are based on the same theoretical arguments or theoretical underpinnings, that is the household production method. And both of these methods, they are used to value the materials as well as the health. And in most of the cases, in both the methods, we are finding the examples that these methods are applicable or generally applied to the health valuation case. And again, both of these methods, they are used to value changes in outcomes of the pollutions, and here we are talking about, let us say, the sickness or the time of the duration of illness, and to value the underlying changes in the pollution that can cause changes in the health outcome, right. So, this is how we can actually bring that we can segregate, we can understand that what is the damage cost method and how it is different from the averting or defensive behavior expenditure method. So, now let us understand what are the applications of the damage cost method. So, we can apply this damage cost method to the materials and damages. If some environmental changes occurred, then how the materials have reduced their value, or what kind of physical damage that has been occurring to the materials because of these environmental changes, let us take the pollution itself. We can also apply this damage cost method for other endpoint damages. So, it may be some other materials, and we can also apply this damage cost method in the health valuation because of the change in pollutions. So, now let us understand what is the cost of illness approach, that is what we are targeting to analyze, and whether this cost of illness method is something different from the damage cost method or are the same. So, when we are saying damage cost method, we are talking about the cost that is in terms of the resources, that is again we are taking into account direct as well as indirect costs. So, here when you are talking about, or when you are specifying some specific applications of the damage costs, and that is in the context of health, then this damage cost can be known as, or it is termed as, the cost of illness approach, right. So, that means this cost of illness approach is a special applications in the context of health, and when this damage cost is applicable in the is applied in case of the health context, then it is known as the cost of illness approach. And we can take the same logic, the way the damage cost is measured. So, the cost of illness, for estimating this cost of illness, we can take into account the direct cost as well as indirect cost, but our focus is on in the health context only. So, take into account the health context, that when pollution increases, how it is impacting the health and what kind of costs we are incurring in terms of health expenditure or something that is related to health because of the increase in pollution. So, in case of this direct costs, because of the change in the increase in the pollutions, we can say direct costs can be estimated, take into account the value of the resources used to diagnose. You are consulting a doctor, so fees that you are actually paying for consulting a doctor, and even the treatment costs or the other medical expenditures, just like your outdoor expenditures, indoor expenditure, the pharmaceutical expenditures, or sometimes we are taking into account some educating that how to avoid this kind of a problem that we are facing because of this pollutions. And we can also take into account the indirect costs, right. So, obviously, this is the value of no output produced or reduced number of output produced because of you are falling sick, that is the morbidity, or you face your death, right. So, that is a kind of premature mortality, and because of which you are losing output produced. So, in a nutshell you can say this for estimating the indirect cost, what we need to take into account is the foregone earnings, that means the earnings that you are not getting, right, because either of your morbidity or mortality. So, in this context we can actually discuss about what are different methods or approaches for measuring the costs, because we are saying this cost of illness can be of these direct costs, we need to take into account indirect costs also. So, for measuring this costs we can apply two approaches. This approach of measurement is based on different measurements of the occurrence of a particular disease or the condition that you are in. So, based on these we can either apply the prevalence based cost or incident based cost. So, cost can be measured in terms of these two situations. So, what are these two situations? When we are talking about the prevalent cost, we need to take into account the prevalent populations. Who are these prevalent populations? So, they are consisted of all the persons, right, who have a conditions or a particular problem, let us say the illness of asthma at a particular given time, right. So, when you are saying it is 2017 and the number of persons who are suffering from asthma is let us say 200 in a particular locality. So, this is what we are saying the prevalent population, these 200 populations number of persons are the prevalent populations. And the second cost is your incident cost, that is explained in terms of take into account the incident population. So, what is incident population? They are consisted of the new cases just discovered or registered cases just now in that particular year. So, new cases diagnosed or registered during that given time. So, accordingly the prevalence cost or the prevalence based cost can be the annual costs associated with the case of the or the level of the conditions of persons during a year. So, this is what these costs are expressed in terms of the annual costs. Whereas, when we are talking about the incidence based costs, then there we are saying that the new cases registered, right. So, that is why for having an idea on the costs on the incidence, we need to take into account the costs related to the lifetime, starting from the diagnosis that this particular disease a person is suffering till the recovery or till the death. So, for example, you can say that if you are following this prevalence approach, and here our example is we are measuring the cause of this illness asthma, then what we are doing, we are focusing on all the persons alive at the beginning of this particular year, those who are diagnosed with asthma. So, in that case what we are doing, we are calculating the direct cost by taking into account the direct cost like treatment costs, charges that we are paying for the emergency room, or you are saying the physician fees, or medicines that we are consuming, right, during a year. But likewise, we can find out the indirect costs by taking into account the morbidity costs in terms of loss of wages or foregone household productions during that year, as well as we need to take into account the mortality costs. For example, if the person has not faced his death, then obviously he could have added some earnings or some household productions, right. So, these household productions, amount of household productions and value of this earning, right, it can be expressed in terms of present value. So, that means when you are saying the person got his death in 2019 itself, but he has a life expectancy till let us say 2060, right, and this life expectancy you can find out from the relevant medical literature, that what is the life expectancy of a person right now. So, based on this understanding, in order to find out the mortality cost, we can say that what is the earnings the person has lost from 2019 to 2060, and we need to actually express these earnings, right, in terms of the present value for the first period 2019. So, what is the earning? Let us say it is 3000 rupees. In 2020, what is the earning? Let us say it is again 3000 rupees. But this 3000 needs to be converted to the base year, that is 2019, because you are actually appraising what is the cost right now. So, we need to take care of this discounting, or you can take into account this present value considerations. And likewise, we need to take into account the household production or the amount of output if suppose say he is alive, he can produce this much of output and the value of this output would be this much, that you can also take into account in indirect costs. So, likewise, in the second approach, that is incident approach, here we are not measuring these costs in terms of annual or per year, rather we are measuring these costs for lifetime, right. So, what we are measuring, the lifetime cost of persons diagnosed with this particular disease during this year, and we are forecasting, and again we need to take into account the discounting costs because of the person is falling sick, or in the case of it is death, over the remaining expectancy life. So, what we are doing, that either we can take the first approach or this second approach in order to find out, in order to estimate the total cost, that is your damage cost, right. But here this is your cost of illness. Therefore, when you are saying that we need to actually take into account the lifetime cost itself, not a particular year, okay. So, that is why this cost is complicated, is more complicated than the first approach. So, now we will just have an understanding that how this willingness to pay and damage costs are related, because in our awarding behavior method, we found that this cost of sickness is from two sources, that is your medical costs because you are sick, and the second one is loss of wage. So, this is a direct cost, this is an indirect cost, right. And from these, the damage cost in this, if this is so, this damage cost in this particular case would be known as the cost of illness approach, because we are only focusing the case of health. So, here we can also find out the marginal impact of a given change in the illness on the cost. So, just by taking into account the first order derivative of this cost of illness, we can find out this is what, if the sickness is increased by one more time, then what will be happening to the medical expenditure, that is the direct cost, and also your indirect cost in terms of loss of wages. And again, because we are comparing this willingness to pay and damage cost method, this willingness to pay for a given reduction in the sickness, it exceeds the cost of illness, right. And why it is so? Why we are making this statement that willingness to pay for reducing this illness is actually greater than the cost of illness? Because we have not taken in this calculation of cost of illness, we are not taken into account the utility value of health for just like pain or suffering. For in case of calculating this cost of illness, what we have taken into account? Just we have taken into account some direct costs and some indirect costs, like your medical expenditure under the direct cost category, right. And in indirect costs, we have taken into account the loss of wages or loss of earnings or loss of output. But in this utility functions that we have already discussed in your awarding behavior expenditure, we have not taken into account that how, because of this illness, how the person will not be happy because of the pain from this particular disease, or how he is suffering. What is the value of this pain, how he is valuing to avoid, or is he doing something, or what is the cause of this pain and what is the cause of this suffering. So, this is not actually reflected in the utility function of the individual, but it should have been. So, that is why this willingness to pay for a given reduction in illness, it exceeds the cost of illness itself. So, based on this understanding, if one has to conduct a cost of illness study, we need to actually take into account this particular valuation problem that determine the appropriate specificity of conditions, that which conditions you are trying to value, whether it is pollution with health and which kind of health, whether it is related to the skin cancer and the pollution, or you are saying it is asthma and the pollutions. So, we need to actually specify the conditions to be valued. Then we need to define the linkages, that what is the linkages or what is the correlations between these environmental conditions and the kind of diseases that we are facing. Then prevalence of incidence, prevalence approach or incidence approach, which kind of approach you are taking into account. The second step would be estimating the direct costs. So, we know what are the direct and indirect costs, we need to take into account. So, after that what we need to do, we need to take into account the adjustment by taking into account the common base year. We need to adjust for changes in prices, take into account the deflation or inflation or wages even. We need to discount the present value, because maybe in the future after second year, fourth year, third year, whatever, you will be getting some utility in terms of cost, and also the adjustment for changes in the prevalence or incidence over the time that we have discussed in these approaches. Moreover, in this context we need to look into that what are the different limitations or challenges that we are facing in this method. So, firstly we can say that we are facing some limitations, their obstacles in terms of the methodological challenges. So, what are the methodological challenges? Again, under this methodological challenges, we need to take into account that most data on the direct cost report charges rather than the cost. So, when you are saying that under direct cost, the person is sick and he has to pay the medical fees, they are the charges, not the cost. And the second one is, this direct cost also includes the fixed overhead like the insurance administrations rather than the only variable costs, right. And why we are saying this is a problem, because fixed costs, fixed over costs are likely to be fixed for the kind of illness you are having. And moreover, the method of the indirect cost measurement that is drawn from, that is largely based on the foregone household productions, it has limitations because they cannot satisfactorily measure the indirect costs. Just like for children, can you assign any wages for their value, so that you can value that this is the time they are not exposed to the outdoor pollutions and they are kept indoor. So, can we actually value that? So, it is not possible. So, that means we cannot have satisfactory method of measurement in order to deal this indirect cost for children, either for children, old age or retired persons. And moreover, in the presence of comorbidities, that means for the during the same time you are having different sickness. So, this particular technique for allocating or apportioning costs are very arbitrary. That if you are saying that you are suffering from this sunburn as well as the cancer because of this particular problem, environmental change, then you cannot actually apportion or allocate that what are the costs, right, for having this sunburn, and what are the costs that you are incurring because of this cancer. And moreover, we are also facing some fundamental challenges. So, you can say this method is not a money measure of welfare change. That means, in a true sense we cannot actually express this in terms of willingness to pay. So, if you are relating this willingness to pay with this cost of illness approach, then we are actually finding a picture of lower bound or lower limit on the willingness to pay. So, that is all about the cost of illness approach, and these are the suggested readings that you must go through. So, this is chapter 11 of this same book, the primer on the non-market valuations. And for the beginners, you can start with the intermediate environmental economics book by Coolstart. Thank you very much.